Welcome to The Classical Mind, a podcast about the great books in the Western canon. We're your hosts. I'm Father Wesley Walker.
And I'm Dr. Junius Johnson.
And today we're very excited to welcome to the show Jesse Hake. Jesse has a Master of Letters in History from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and has been a teacher and an academic dean and principal at 2 classical Christian schools. And currently he works at Classical Academic Press, where he serves as the director of classicalu.com. Jesse, thanks for joining us today. How are you doing?
Very good. It's wonderful to join both of you. This is a real delight. Thank you.
Yes, we're so excited to have you. This is going to be a great conversation. We're talking today about Love in the Ruins by Walker Percy. And I think we'll start with Junius. We like to talk kind of about our experiences with the text. Junius, what's your experience with Love in the Ruins?
Well, this is a book I'd never read before. I've heard it referenced a bunch, and I was a colleague with Ralph Wood for a time at Baylor, and Ralph is a very big fan of Southern fiction and all of these types of things, and so he would talk about it all the time, but I never really read it. Southern fiction is outside of my wheelhouse. So I read it for the first time for this, and I think my reaction to it is, what just happened? What am I even seeing here? So many times as I'm reading this thing, I would have either a strong reaction of what, or a more perplexed reaction of, okay, where are we going? It was fascinating, and it definitely kept me reacting. But yeah, this was a very different to most things I've ever read before.
Excellent. I just want to flag for the listeners that Junius said he's never read this before, which is a big deal, because I feel like most of the books he puts up, he read once when he was a freshman in college, and then he read it at least 2 more times since then. So,
yeah, I didn't think there was anything he hadn't read twice, let alone once.
That's right. That's right.
He is human after all.
That's right. That's right. Jesse, what about you? What is your sort of background with Love in the Ruins?
Yeah, a long time ago, had read it and dipped back into it just recently to refresh myself. And I was feeling like, it's one of those books that is genre defying and a little shocking, and takes you for quite a ride emotionally. And there's so many different things going on in it. But overall, I guess I felt like it was more relevant than last time I read it. I mean, the part of that is, I guess, any book that's got some depth, and layers to it. As you grow as a person, you have that experience. But I also feel like, so I guess I am making the claim that maybe I've grown as a person a little in, 15 years or whatever. But I think also just the kind of social political commentary is fascinating. 1971, I think. Mm-hmm. It's almost feels more like crazy satire, applicable now even than in the 70s. But
absolutely. I during COVID, I went on a big kick of reading a bunch of Catholic novels. And part of that was because I was on a Zoom. I had a friend of mine who started a Zoom call every day called Coffee Hour, British friend of mine. And so we would all get on, and I got to meet all these cool people who were all over the country and even in England. And there were a couple of good Roman Catholic guys in there. And so we would often talk about their literature. And so this came up a couple times, and just based on how they talked about it, I knew I had to read it. So I read it. I think it was 2021, and really, really enjoyed it. And of course, it felt very apt then, kind of during the COVID years, but it still feels very apt even today. The more things change, the more they stay the same, I suppose. So it's a great book.
Yeah.
Perhaps we should say a little bit about Walker Percy as we enter into the book. He was born early 20th century in Alabama, I think 1916. And his family had kind of a tragic history of suicide. His father committed suicide while he was just a teenager, and then his mother died in a car accident about 2 years later, and we're not really sure if it was an accident. And so certainly a lot of grief. You can maybe understand why he gravitates towards those existential questions and things. And then he actually went on to study. He went to study to be a physician. His caretaker basically told him, you have to either go into the military, study law, or study medicine. And so he studied medicine, but he contracted tuberculosis while doing so, which put a pause on his plans. And during that pause, he really took an interest in literature, and ended up studying semiotics a lot, which makes some sense of this book, I think, and some of the kind of symbols and signs that are used. And of course, his wife and him both converted to Catholicism, which comes out very prevalently in the book.
Yeah.
So, any other tidbits from his life that maybe are worth mentioning?
I'm not from his life. I'm starting to think of kind of parallels with the protagonist, Dr. Moore, in the book. There's quite a lot in that kind of history of family tragedy. Yeah. There's little hints of almost autobiographical. That's pretty common in novels, but with the author.
So the full text of the book, we should say, it's called Love in the Ruins, but the subtitle is The Adventures of a Bad Catholic at a Time Near the End of the World. It's a fantastic title.
Yep.
And so the main character is this psychologist, Thomas More, who's named after Sir Thomas More, the Roman Catholic martyr and author of the satirical book Utopia. And I should say I have a kind of odd devotion to St. Thomas More, which is strange as an Anglican priest to say, because it was the Anglicans who martyred Thomas More. But I was actually ordained in St. Thomas More Roman Catholic Church in Lynchburg, Virginia. And so
wow,
it has a special place in my heart. It was a very ecumenical affair, and being ordained at a Roman church called Thomas More. But More is an interesting fella. He is an alcoholic who wakes up every morning drinking vodka and Tang with egg whites, as you do. And he is a lapsed Catholic who has an interesting family life. His wife sort of did Eat, Pray, Love before it was cool. She goes off to find herself somewhere and leaves him, and she ends up dying, I think, in some foreign country.
She does. She runs off with an Englishman, I think, right?
That's right. That's right.
And she failed to change her will, and so when she dies, Dr. Moore inherits all her house and all the things that she owned, and so he's living off of his ex-wife's money, who ran away from and left him.
That's the ultimate insult too, that Thomas More's wife would run off with an Englishman.
Yeah, a heathen Englishman, and he notes that he's not sure he's ever met an Englishman that wasn't a heathen.
Great.
But yeah, the whole scenario of sort of who she runs off with. I love your comparison, Eat, Pray, Love.
Yes, yes, she's Elizabeth Gilbert.
When you first jumped in, you shifted very fast from Sir Thomas More, you're a saint who you love, to the protagonist who has the same name, and the saint was not an alcoholic.
That's right. That's true.
You shifted like within almost one conjunctive clause in the same sentence or something. But
as far as we know.
Yeah. But yeah, he's a real mess. I mean, so the protagonist in the book, named after the saint, is a disaster, and it's a little agonizing reading, for that reason.
Yeah, that's right. That was one of my struggles with him in the early chapters, was just he's laying out this litany of failure in his life and how he had all this potential and it all came to nothing, and he's sitting in this place waiting for the end of the world, and it's just, I'm like, wow, this dude is in a really bad place, and it was kind of hard to read at some points.
And at one point Walker Percy says women are smarter than psychiatrists in here, and it strikes me that here we are, three dudes trying to talk about the book. So
that's right. We should also point out one other kind of tragedy that plays into Thomas More's character, which is the death of his daughter. She died a few years before the novel takes place of cancer. And so that seems to be a very present thing that he's grappling with, even when he's not talking about it. It seems you're sort of haunted by that. That's really a big theme of the book, I think, is the idea of haunting. And I think she haunts him in a way that throughout the novel.
Yeah, because the ways he describes her, they were so close, and she was his where his marriage was distant, she was his connection, and they did things together. And so you really do feel what a big hole her loss leaves in his life.
And you kind of gather that's one of the reasons why he lapses in his Catholicism, is that was such a huge part of their relationship. They would walk to church together and go to mass and all that. And without her, he becomes, pardon the pun, unmoored.
Yeah. In fact, I think it's pretty explicit that it's tied up to his wife's sort of going off the rails as well. So and their marriage isn't described as particularly bad. There's a point where she spiritualizes love, or something is the phrase, as she chases the exotic Oriental fantasies or whatever. But I think that the daughter's death is central to the sort of destruction of both of them. And it's certain that it's a beautiful passage that describes he and his daughter walking home after mass and the Eucharist. There's really moving couple of paragraphs, that whole sequence.
Yes. So all the sort of internal divisions of the main character reflect in some ways the divisions of the America in which the book is set. So there is a very polarized left and right dynamic at play. Both sides are very radicalized. Does that sound
with
familiar?
Hysterical nicknames,
nicknames. The liberals are the left papasne, which is an acronym for what the right thinks the left believes in. Right? Liberty, equality, fraternity, the pill, atheism, pot, anti-pollution, sex, abortion now, and euthanasia. And all the liberals, of course, are they suffer from depression, anxiety, night terrors, sexual impotence, but they have successfully removed "In God We Trust" from the penny, much to their credit. And the conservatives are knotheads, which I think was based on a slogan, right? No man can be too knotheaded in the service of his country, which was reappropriated from a liberal critic.
Yes. So they're both named in the great American tradition. They both adopt the names that have been given to them by their critics.
That's right.
It's hysterical. And then their ailments, are this great satire again. So the conservatives have their list of ailments, and the liberals have their list of ailments.
Angry outbursts and constipation, right? And they have successfully enacted a law requiring compulsory prayer in Black public schools, and made funds available for birth control in Africa, Asia, and Alabama.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah.
So you have
that would hit hard.
Yes. So you have a very divided world, and as a result, it seems to be collapsing. There's this kind of moral decay. There's a lack of continuity in terms of American identity. There are these tribalistic factions, and so the novel opens in this world, and Moore is at a hotel.
Can I stop you before you go to that point?
Go ahead.
Because I want to complete the thought you started. Or actually, I want to make you complete the thought you started, which was you mentioned that the character of Moore has these divisions within himself that mirror the divisions in the society, but there's also the external divisions in the town where he lives that are incarnations of the divisions in the society. And can you tell us about the 4 districts of this town that he lives in?
Wow. Okay. Well, I feel like I've been put on the spot here. I actually didn't have anything on the 4 districts of the town. But could you finish it then?
One is Paradise, right?
Paradise Falls, I think it's called.
Yeah.
And then there's the swamp where all of these the criminals and the undesirable elements have kind of fled to. Yeah, hippies and whatnot, and Black people. And then there's the kind of I guess I don't know what they call it, but it's like a scientific district. It's where the hospital is, and where all the sort of research dollars go. And then the 4th district, I don't remember what the 4th district was. Anyone got it?
It is where the serving class lives. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's right.
Yeah, the swamp are the
Yeah.
kind of, they've rejected
Burnouts.
society, run, sort of run away from the world, and they tend to be very, sort of spiritually in tune and,
The monks. They're the monks.
yeah, and living in certain respects, lives that are represented as rather beautiful and attractive, but incredibly destitute in the swamps. Yeah, and then the business, they're the conservatives generally, and that's the Paradise Falls, right? And then the scientific district, they're the left or liberal, generally speaking. And there's a research center like the Love Laboratory,
That's right.
where one of his three love interests, following his wife's running away, comes from. But anyway, we're really starting to wander all over the map and jump, but it's so complicated. Like you open up and it moves back in time too, right? Early on.
Mhm.
So the plot development, the sort of setting, the satirical layers, there's a lot to kind of dig into. It's hard to unpack.
So he's he, speaking of those different districts, I mean, in some ways, the three women that he's with are kind of from different segments of the town. So there's so it opens with him at this abandoned hotel, and there's a sniper. He thinks there's this sniper that's out to get him, and so he has these three women in these three hotel rooms, and then there's a fourth hotel room with a bunch of books and food, and whiskey. And so one woman, Lola, is a secretary who represents sort of the pleasure and escape kind of lust. Myra, who's a patriotic conservative who represents kind of conservative values. And then there's Ellen, the Presbyterian nurse, who is kind of, I mean, really, she's the possibility of redemption. She's the right choice, and he's got to kind of overcome the other choices.
Grounded.
Yes. So the device that he invents, how would you describe Dr. Moore's device? The ontological lapsometer.
Well, I love the the kind of metaphorical or the exploration of metaphysical questions through analogy that it opens up. It is a little simplistic in my sort of feel as a science fiction, but that's what science fiction does. It's super simplistic, but he's able to scan at multiple layers, sort of all the way through the various layers of the mind and all the sort of electromagnetic activity of individuals, and able to make very direct, one-to-one correlations between various kind of physical and mental health issues. And it lines, these line up in this hysterical way with the satirical ailments that the conservatives have versus the leftists have. But as he identifies this way to really easily and quickly pinpoint exactly what's sort of bothering any particular person by mapping the electromagnetic activity in their mind, he then begins to wonder, what if I could also with this device add another feature, which would be to stimulate those locations in the mind where there's some issue. It's basically very simplistic, kind of either in one particular specific zone of the mind or another. You have either too much electromagnetic activity or too little electromagnetic activity, and if you can kind of stimulate and turn it up or down, you can alleviate some of these sort of struggles in life. And he figures out how to do that. So now he's got a device. It's like a handheld device. He can just walk around anybody he meets with. He's got it in his doctor's bag, but he's using it outside of medical context as well, at people's sort of when people pressure him. And he realized now he's able to both sort of scan you and treat you within like 5 minutes, on the road, in the field. And it's this crazy raw power, to sort of heal humanity in a very shallow kind of way as well, right?
Yep. And it's because of that power that it becomes a kind of attractive thing for government and corporate interests. And so a lot of the plot revolves around kind of the attempt to steal and weaponize that, which
Mm-hmm.
actually pushes people kind of further into their neuroses. It's those psychological divisions are made worse by it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in a funny way, just by the existence of it, even before it starts getting misused for its inherent power, the fact of its existence exacerbates the neuroses that are there. And it's worth mentioning that the name, the lapsometer, right? It's from Latin lapsus. It's measuring fallenness. It's measuring how far you've fallen, and that's an interesting nod there as well.
Yeah, the particular way in which you fell and the extent to which you've fallen. Yeah, he's got so much, just layers of clever language usage and puns and satire. That way in which just the existence of the device causes all these issues, and then the way in which it, he's got so many problems himself, and then the society he's in is in such dire straits. That just creates really interesting dynamic kind of material, in the plot line and the character relationships where it's causing, he's thrilled because it's an incredible scientific, kind of discovery, and also a sort of spiritual discovery, right? And he's he's been a very pious Catholic. He remains a very pious Catholic, although lapsed and bad, as the subtitle says. But so it's tempting him to this kind of hubris. It's tempting people around him. A lot going up.
He's afraid that the world's gonna end before he gets to publish his journal article on it.
Yeah.
I know that fear. Especially given how long it takes journal articles to come out. There's also I love that you use the word lapsed of his Catholicism, Jesse, because this is one of the things. It's the same word as the lapsometer. And that connects right to this other thought that I was having, which is there is an aspect of physician heal thyself at work here. Yes. You're walking around with a tool that can tell you how far people have lapsed and can fix it. And you are a lapsed Catholic. Why are you still so messed up when the solution to being messed up as a human is in your pocket?
Yeah, that phrase is repeated in the book probably, dozens of times. Yeah, that's really interesting.
This is why, in a sense, he had to not only be a scientist, but he had to specifically be a doctor. To deepen the symbolism and connect those dots.
I think Percy is doing that on purpose because he wants us to understand that the sort of modernist emphasis on scientism is so kind of silly, that there could be that distance between the sort of objective observer and the treatment itself. At one point, he actually says, "A note for physicians: if you listen carefully to what patients say, they will often tell you what is wrong with them, but also what is wrong with you." So there's no neutral observation. It's like the Heisenberg principle. Everything is changed by the observer, including the observer.
Yes, and that's one of the points of the device not only being able to measure, but also being able to affect. Because according to Heisenberg, measurement is affecting, it is acting upon, and so there's an illusory line between those two things in the first place. And so I think that's really an important aspect of the device and how it connects up to the larger. What is he doing? You can't just go around being I'm outside the story, but measuring the story and changing the story. No, you're inside the story.
Yeah. Another aspect of the device I don't think we mentioned is the two terms, the kind of poles that he's operating between is angelicism and what's the other end of that? A kind of
something with bestiality.
Yeah, I think it's
bestialism or something like
essentially. That. Yeah, connect to the word bestial. So you've kind of got angelicism and bestial, and certain people he's trying to sell it to are really put off by those kind of spiritual categories, theological categories. But that's really what he's operating in, and a key aspect of the negative, extreme of angelicism is that you kind of have this bifurcation or split between spirit and body, and one of the kind of science fiction elements of it is when you bring the kind of electromagnetic activity of various parts of the brain into harmony, you end up bringing spirit and body into what they actually are, which is sort of inseparable. I love this passage. Just a short reference. It's almost, I mean, pretty clearly a Gerard Manley Hopkins reference as well. What if man could re-enter paradise, so to speak, and live there both as man and spirit, whole and intact, man spirit, as solid flesh as a speckled trout, a dappled thing, yet aware of itself as a self. So that's a description of what he hopes to be able to achieve with his lapsometer, kind of healing people and restoring them to paradise. But direct references there to beautiful poetry from Hopkins.
Yeah, and the problem with that, theologically, of course, is that he is completely mistaken what man is, because he in calling man and spirit as distinct things, he's treating the biological entity that is that we are, the biological part of the human being, as simply the human being, and so that's a symptom of the character's own misunderstanding of the nature of reality.
Yeah, that's a good question. I had just, not that long ago, one of the last books I read was All Things Are Full of Gods by David Bentley Hart, which is all about the the mind-body problem kind of in philosophy. So it was on my mind a lot. And I think he's trying to get at, the man spirit. That's in the text, that's a hyphenated, it's trying to sort of collapse them together so that the body and the spirit are inseparable. So you like Paul has the one phrase at one point, a spiritual body, which is kind of feels like an oxymoron to us, right? But I feel like that's what he's driving at, which is a good direction. I feel like metaphysically and theologically.
It is. The problem is that it's predicated upon the notion, it's what you call the halves, right? Spirit is fine, but the other half is body, and only when you've got body spirit hyphenated do you have a man. But by calling the body man, and then you get man spirit, it gives an integrity to the physical thing that it doesn't normally have in theology, right? The body is not its own substance apart from the soul. When the soul and the body dies. But I think Walker Percy gets this, and I think he's doing it on purpose. Because it's the character's misunderstanding, not the author's misunderstanding. That what Dr. Moore is not recognizing, he's giving the biological half of the human person complete ontological autonomy, and then saying what we've got to do is reunite it with this other thing, which therefore feels somewhat external to the body. And so he breaks the Aristotelian hoolomorphism that sees these things as intricately and intimately tied to each other and is not being able to exist well apart from each other.
It's like scientific Nestorianism.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
readers, if you can follow that comment, you've been listening to us way too much.
I feel like the science fiction kind of pretense that he's using to get at these metaphysical questions might cloud or distort. Exactly. So I would agree with you, Genius, that I don't think this is a confusion on the part of Walker Percy as the author, but exactly where Dr. Moore is coming out on this question isn't as clear to me. The device is very clunky as a kind of science fiction entry into the metaphysical questions. But
that's kind of the interesting thing about it too, is that the device is a classic MacGuffin. It makes the plot work. You need it for the plot to work, and yet the least interesting thing about the novel is the details of the device.
Right. Yeah.
But in some ways, doesn't Moore kind of suffer? I mean, you can kind of see where he suffers from this misunderstanding, not only in his sort of academic, intellectual work, but in his personal life. The way he treats his body, he almost acts as if the soul and body are so separate. But what we see as the reader is that they're so intricately connected that what he's doing to his body is affecting his soul, and vice versa. Yeah,
I think that's exactly right. Because the choices he makes, which are the grounds of his failure, and he'd be the first to admit this. Dr. Moore locates his many failures in his own character. These are all flow out of the fundamental way that he views the world. And the device gives him a way to manipulate the world but it doesn't actually give him any greater understanding of the nature of the world. And that's
Mm-hmm.
why we see him, even though he has the ability to manipulate and make changes in people, essentially make people moral by the push of a button. It doesn't help him become a better person any at all. We find him at the beginning of the book sitting there waiting for the end of the world, getting drunk on the nastiest drink humanity has ever concocted with 3 women that he loves, quote unquote,
Stashed away in the
3
motel.
hotel rooms next to each other. Then these are the 3 women with whom
Yeah.
he's going to live after the world ends, that he can even imagine that he could have any sort of bliss after the end of the world with 3 different women who can't stand each other.
Yeah, yeah, and the great books, piled up, like,
Right.
and he says, that open with the Homeric line and end with Freud. That whole description of the 3 women and the food, what and the drink that he's got stashed away is just hysterical. It struck me only just now as you were describing it, sort of back to me, that this is a very Jonah image. Like the book opens with the prophet Jonah sitting on the hilltop waiting for the destruction of the city, right? Anyway, I hadn't sort of made that connection till just now. But you were talking about genre, Wesley, I think.
Yep.
As one point, there's so many great things to sort of bring up, but I wonder if you want to.
Well, I think we might want to just kind of try to describe to our listeners what genre you would use for this book. I mean, and it's hard to really pin it down. We've mentioned science fiction. The Lapsometer is certainly a kind of sci-fi like device. And within that, we could even maybe categorize it as like a dystopian science fiction. It certainly has that feel to it as well. I've seen speculative fiction used to describe it, though I think that's very broad and probably unhelpful.
I consider speculative fiction a generic term that covers science fiction and fantasy and all of their incarnations.
Yeah, so then it wouldn't be particularly helpful here if we've already kind of narrowed down to science fiction. There are some ways in which it's a satire, I suppose. And then another term that's been used has been Southern Gothic.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because we just did The Castle of Otranto, which is sort of the proto-Gothic novel. But you can kind of see some overlaps. I mean, there's this decaying setting, the vines growing up on all the buildings and the dilapidation that's occurred. The sort of eccentric characters, the way they're almost caricatures of real things. And then I think the themes of sin and guilt and redemption kind of maybe perpetuate that as well. So I don't know. What do you think?
The Oriental, his wife runs off, with this kind of, Eastern mystic, fantasy. And so I think there are quite a few elements of that, but it also doesn't work ultimately, necessarily. The sort of genre-defying character of the book, it reminds me a little of some of G.K. Chesterton's works, where you just sort of go around and around, and it fits into several different categories, but none of them very well.
It makes me think of, so I'm going to go back to the title, Love in the Ruins, which ought to prompt the question, the ruins of what? Right? And my sense from my first read, and pick everything I say with a grain of salt because it's a first read. And so, what have I really picked up? But my sense is that it's the ruins of society, first and foremost. And then in a secondary sense, because as Jesse's been pointing out, with all the layers, this book is very polysemous. Everything's got multiple meanings. In the secondary sense, it's the ruins of Dr. Moore's life itself. But as the ruins of society, in a sense, what you have then is, what are ruins? Ruins are the detritus, the remains, the leavings. They used to be other things than they are now, and those things had a purpose and a function, but now that society is gone, that purpose is no longer there, and they've fallen from the form they had when they were purposeful, and they are, that building is no longer a building, it's a shell, it's a facade that maintains the form but lacks any of the useful internal bits that make a building what it is. That being the case, I'm tempted to say that what we have here, the genre of this novel, is I think all the things that you guys said are accurate and apply to it, but at the end of the day, genres are some of the ruins that this novel inhabits. And so it approaches all of these different genres that we know, but it fails to actually be an instance of any of these genres, because that the genres themselves are structures of the society that the novel situates itself in the ruins of.
Wow, I love that. So he's intentionally constructing a novel out of bits and pieces of broken genres.
Yeah. And have you guys been to the City Museum in St. Louis?
No.
If you ever find yourself in St. Louis with or without children, go to the City Museum. It is absolutely delightful. If you can imagine, the listeners who've been there are nodding vigorously right now, and listeners who haven't, like, oh, what's he going to talk about? The conceit of this museum is that they've made a museum that's really not a museum. It's a play space. It's a massive, I don't know, 5 or 6 story play space in this giant old warehouse building. But they've made all of the play equipment out of bits of the city. Things left over from various construction or from old buildings that were taken down and all this other sort of stuff. And that's why it's called as the City Museum. The playground that the building is itself a museum of all of these things that used to be functional parts of the city. And they built, multi-story slides, and there's this airplane suspended in the air, and you kind of go through these wire frames through the airplane and up to this castle turret and all these kinds of, it's a really amazing, it's the most incredible play space I've ever seen. But what I love about it, in addition to it just being a fantastic play space, again, not just for children, everything is big enough for adults. And first time I went, it was just my wife and I, and we had a fantastic time. But what I love about it is the idea that it's repurposing the city's castaways, the city's leavings, into something that will be a space that children can inhabit with joy. That's what this feels like to me. It's that sort of city museum, except it hasn't been made as a play space for children and a cathedral of joy. It's rather been made as a kind of mausoleum that oppresses you with its own, with the weight of its own failure. These ruins are not glorious in any way. They are not, and they're not something to celebrate. They're just kind of, this is what we're left with.
So I think I can understand the point as to how this would apply to the novel, especially in terms of the science fiction stuff, because I mean, I think science fiction kind of is hand in hand with modernity, that narrative of progress, technological advancement. If only we have this device or this discovery, then the world will be saved or whatever. So I can definitely see that very clearly in this. I guess what I would be interested to hear, Junius, is how Southern Gothic might be kind of repurposed here.
So there's a couple of thoughts I have about that. The first, the southern part of it is the part I'm least qualified to speak on. Even though I am from the South and live in the South, I've not imbibed a lot of Southern literature. But it's not quite a Gothic novel. There's not, the supernatural is not present enough. The uncanny is not present enough. It makes appearances for sure, but it always veers off in a pseudoscientific direction. And so that's the failure of it to be a Gothic novel, is that it's drawing upon some of the feelings that we get from the Gothic novels, obsession with the uncanny and centralization of the uncanny. And yet it doesn't. And again, also like the big surprising twists, the fast reversals and flips. It seems like we're going to get those, and then we often back away, because we start very close to the end. And when you do that, it's hard to give the big twists, because we know that, but no matter what happens, it's going to bend back towards sitting at the crossroads by that hotel waiting to be taken out by the sniper. So there's that aspect with the Gothic thing. And I think also with the Southern, when I think of Southern literature, and again, this is, take this with a high grain of salt. People who love Southern literature, please, I absolutely decry my ignorance, but my experience of Southern literature has been that while on the one hand, there's a great deal of, let's call it, wonder sickness, where the mundanity of life in the South, often in the very poor South, creates both in the characters and in the reader a kind of crisis of the loss of wonder. There's also a kind of beauty that shines through in key moments in the stories that transforms that every day into something transcendent. And so I feel like very often in Southern novels, while you may begin mired in a world that feels too small to satisfy a human soul, the key moment is a recognition that these small things are big things, and that one can find satisfaction in them. And again, this novel feels like he could be setting you up for that. That could be where we're going to go, but it's not where we go. And so in that sense, it turns away from being the type of Southern novel that we've had, before him and before someone like a Flannery O'Connor. But even Flannery O'Connor, although those turns are usually very, very dark and have to do with death, there is still the turn. There is the glory in the eyes of the dead man and that sort of a thing. And here, I don't think we get there.
Because it ends with a grounded Presbyterian woman? Is that what makes it fail as a Gothic novel?
I plead the fifth. As someone married to a grounded Presbyterian woman, I refuse to address that.
Hey, me too.
Well, just because it's his telos is not transcendence. I think Flannery O'Connor's telos still is transcendence, but she's going to make you pay for it. She's going to take you there through awful places. That's not what he's aiming at.
What is he aiming at? There's a way in which I do read it as, a case, I guess, anti-Gothic in a sense, that you're, I think lining up with what you're saying, but in which, it is a case for the mundane, a case for the, groundedness and embodied mundane life, right? But not without, I don't read it as absent connection to the inward largeness of things, or the, or the transcendent in the mundane kind of a thing. So I'm curious, you seem to be taking it a little more anti-transcendence or something than I'm necessarily reading it.
I think that my sense is not that the message of the novel is anti-transcendence, because I think it's actually quite the opposite, but that in the way of delivering the message is that the character's trajectory doesn't aim at transcendence, right? He winds up with a very stable woman at the end of the thing. But I don't. Oh, so for example, do you think that he has accomplished the union of the biological and the spiritual that he talks about in himself at the end of the story? It doesn't seem to me that he does.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. That I feel like that's one of the maybe best questions you could ask about the book, honestly. Yeah,
right.
It is entirely within the biological almost, like the everyday, the mundane, earthly experience that it would be located. But I'd be curious.
Here's another way of asking it. Here's another way of asking my question. Does he become a good Catholic at the end of the story? Because I feel like that is set up for us by both the subtitle and his own self-narrative in the early chapters. That's set up as one of his central problems. Like one of the central dissociations of his being is that he's a bad Catholic. That's one of the things I would want to see healed in him, to think that this story were reaching a true, because what does it mean to find meaning in the everyday in a Catholic worldview, if not to come to it sacramentally, to come to see the spiritual in the physical, right? I think when he comes to reaches, it feels to me more like resignation than like reconciliation.
The sacraments cut both ways, right? So it's, wheat from the fields, juice from the grapes. It's Christ's presence in extremely mundane things, out alongside the dusty roads, of our farms in which we labor.
That's right.
So, I think
just to have bread and grape juice on the dusty road of the farm is not yet to have the body and blood of Christ. to become reconciled to the goodness of bread and grape juice, which is a good thing, is not yet to have the body and blood of Christ. It's a step to it, perhaps. But so my question is his reconciliation at the end of the story merely imminent, or is it also transcendent? Does he become resigned to physical things, make peace with them, or does he truly see them transformed into not only everyday things?
Shmeiman, has a great line about the sacraments. He's actually interestingly referring to the theophany, the blessing of holy water, specifically in this quote, which extends the sacraments a little bit beyond the 7. But he says that, when we bless holy water at theophany, we're simply revealing what water is. We're revealing the everyday water that we all are blessed by, in our drinking and washing, to be holy.
That's right.
So that, I think there's a case to be made that he becomes a good Catholic in sort of descending into the mundane goodness of everyday life. But it's not the dots aren't connected, or we're not. It's not made super clear. So
I think that I kind of think he does become a good Catholic at the end of the novel, and I would say it's because he is participating in the sacramental life of the church. Like, there's that conversation he has with the priest towards the end. I think it's chapter chapter 8 of the sort of final section, and he's talking with the priest, and he's like, well, but I still like have these desires, to go commit adultery and to drink. And the priest is like, yeah, but did you do it? And he's like, well, no, but the priest kind of stops him, but I think there's always that tension, in the life of any Christian. And I think from a Catholic perspective, this is even more brought out, that we kind of live with this concupiscence, but it's not necessarily a it's more of a question of what we do with it when we have it. And so, like, there's that really interesting image in the kind of last chapter where he's barbecuing in his sackcloth. I really like, but I think that is actually a decent description of what it means to be a Catholic Christian, that you do live in sort of rhythms of penance and celebration at the same time. That's the whole church calendar. Every Easter has its Lent, and every Christmas it's Advent.
Well, and more poignantly, within Lent, every Sunday is a festival.
Right.
So the 40 days of Lent are punctuated by days that are explicitly not in Lent, though calendrically they follow in the midst of your time of feasting. Of fasting.
But I think really that whole last, in fact, I think I'm just going to read it if that's okay, because I think this whole last section really, I think, makes the case that he is living a good Catholic life. So he says, barbecuing in my sackcloth, the turkey is smoking well, the children have gone to bed, but they'll be up at dawn to open their presents. The night is clear and cold, there is no moon, the light of the transmitter lies hard by Jupiter, ruby and diamond in the plush velvet sky. Ellen is busy in the kitchen fixing stuffing and sweet potatoes. Somewhere in the swamp, a screech owl cries. I'm dancing around to keep warm, hands in pockets. It is Christmas Day, and the Lord is here, a holy night, and surely that is all one needs. On the other hand, I want a drink. Fetching the early times from a clump of palmetto, I take 6 drinks in 6 minutes. Now I'm dancing and singing old Sinatra songs and the Salve Regina, cutting the fool like David before the ark, or like the Walter Houston doing a jig when he struck it rich in the Sierra Madre. The turkey is ready. I take it to the kitchen and grab Ellen from behind. She smells of flour and stuffing and like a Georgia girl. And then they have a little back and forth. And then at the end, she puts the spoon down and I put her down on the new $600 bed. To bed we go for a long winter's nap, twined about each other as the ivy twineth, not under a bush or in a car or on the floor or any such humbug as marked by the past peculiar years of Christendom, but at home in bed where all good folks belong. So all of his desires, sort of disordered desires, are finding culmination in right use. I think
Mhm,
he's not quite
mhm.
there. I mean, I don't think he's perfect. He's not, deified yet.
Yeah.
But his drinking is celebratory. It's part of his
Mm.
celebration of Christmas. His sexual appetite is being fulfilled in bed with his wife the way that God intended it to be.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
do think there is a clear evolution of character from the guy who's getting drunk just to be drunk and the guy who's womanizing and doing all sorts of things earlier in the book. I think he's at least moving towards being a good
Yeah.
guy.
The sequence of direct like parallels between that and the passage about walking home with his daughter after the
Mhm.
Eucharist, very near the beginning of the book, are astonishing as well. So I think there's a kind of movement from a romanticized relationship to the sacraments that
Mhm.
he's enjoying with his daughter, which isn't a bad thing. It's just kind of a immature thing in your Christian walk, sacramentally, maybe. And then it grows deeper, and the sacramental life fully comes into his home and into his marriage relationship,
Mhm. Mhm.
which is really profound. So it moves from a parent-child relationship
Mhm.
and a little bit kind of romanticized to a full spousal relationship, entirely grounded holistically within the home.
Yeah.
And he's dancing, like in both passages. There's multiple things that are just direct parallels. I hadn't jumped out at me, but yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's a
I
strong
think it's
case.
great.
One other possible line to follow, and maybe we don't want to go all the way down this rabbit trail, but I think one thing that marks Southern literature, and Junius, I think you were sort of talking about this a little bit earlier, is that there is a kind of nostalgia in much of it, a longing for things to
Mhm.
be the way that they were. And that plays into, I think, what you're saying, Jesse, which is that in the beginning and the middle of the book, you kind of get the idea that he is nostalgic for that past.
Mhm.
His daughter, his wife, but of course the whole thing, I mean, is revealed to be somewhat of a facade. He's going to church because he's with his daughter. His wife and him don't really, I mean, the relationship falls apart. And so there's a kind of fakeness to that picture that he's painted of how maybe perfect things were then.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that does seem to cut against some of the tendencies when you are talking about Southern media, whether that's literature or country music or whatever. That's a big part of it, and I do think he's critical of that. And I think, I mean, you see that in other ways. Like I think his critique of race kind of does that as well. The way that he talks about race, because you do get the idea that the conservatives in particular are kind of locked into that nostalgic view of the past, right? So we don't actually have to engage with Black communities because we're just keep maintaining a rigid social order. And even the liberals who do engage do it in a romanticizing way, in a way that the Black community becomes a pawn in a larger political agenda, and nothing they ever do actually improves their lives.
Yeah.
And so it's this kind of broken system of always looking backwards and romanticizing and giving it a nostalgia. Which then, of course, like Art Immelman, the government agent, uses that to exacerbate tensions. He makes it worse,
Yeah.
And I think Walker Percy was concerned about that. I mean, I think throughout the novel, he kind of mentions Americans' view of race and how it is a very sort of tragic or fundamental flaw that really potentially ruins the whole thing. And I think you could kind of make the same point in a maybe more microcosmic way with Dr. Moore, that his nostalgia ends up affecting him in the present in very negative ways, in ways that can potentially derail him.
Yeah.
Okay, I find all of that very compelling, and I think it's a very good, and I do feel that question is that on which the whole novel turns, and so sticking in line with this reading that he defines a true reconciliation within himself at the end, then that means that we also take the other part of the title seriously, which is love. The love that's in the ruins is real love at the end of the story. And so this is not, because one of the questions you have at the opening of the novel is love possible in the ruins? And this ending, this reading of the ending, which I very much like, says that the answer is a resounding yes. And we can see an image of what one way that love can look in the ruins. And that's not just or primarily his love for his wife, but his love for his wife is a part of it, because what it is love as a singular thing that encompasses all the things that we love, and therefore a well-ordered love.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Can I take it a step further and say that maybe rather than just is love possible in the ruins, that maybe the point is love is only possible in the ruins? That one has to be sort of stripped of the kind of false pretenses. I mean, socially, I think that it's the false pretenses of modernity that have to be deconstructed. But then personally, it's those stories we tell about ourselves. It's those self-justifications that we use in order to perpetuate certain choices that we make. And so for him to actually love, or for society to actually find any sort of love, those things have to be excised. And so you can only really find love once that's happened. I mean, it's the same thing with the idea of grace. You know, I mean, grace requires there to be a sinner who is redeemed. But like a good person, it's what Jesus says. I didn't come for the good. I came for the sick. And so once one is aware of that and lays that bare, then love becomes possible.
Yeah,
I'm gonna push back on you there.
Go for it.
I might give you that in the type of modern world that he's describing, love is only possible in the ruins. But when I look at the classic example for me of well-ordered love is Dante. And there's nothing ruins about Dante to me. Dante's ruined in Inferno, but he doesn't find love in Inferno. He has to come out of the ruins and into the glorious kingdom to find love. And so I think it might be you particularly modernist to think that love is only possible in the ruins.
Okay, now we're gonna get into Dante. I mean, I think you do find Dante ruined at the very beginning of the novel, of the story, but the fact that Virgil is sent to him at all is an act of love that he has to receive kind of at that low point. And yeah, he has to go through hell, and then he doesn't get to Beatrice until later. But I'm not sure I would buy that that's entirely contradictory to what I'm saying.
Let's take the preposition seriously, right? At the end of the novel, the love that Dr. Moore has literally takes place in the ruins of this society that he's been describing all along. He still lives in Paradise Estates, and this is still a ruined town with all of the broken ruinous, that the blacks are in charge now, and they're going to oppress the whites, and all of that stuff is still true. So where his love is situated is the ruins. Dante experiences love in the ruins and is carried through the literal ruins of the infernal city in Dis, but where his love ends up, where his love takes place, is not in the ruins. It's actually someplace else. And so I think that is a key difference that if we bring Aristotle into it, right? You judge a life by its ending. You judge a story by its ending. And so Dante is love out of the ruins, whereas Walker Percy is love in the ruins.
I mean,
I think that's a key distinction between medieval and modern ways of looking at the world, is that the modern world has to come to terms with the brokenness and the ruins because they don't think that's ever going to go away. There's no other option. Whereas the medieval world says, but the brokenness is transitory, and the non-brokenness will last so long that it will make this brokenness seem like it never happened.
I feel like you're repeating a kind of argument in a few different ways, you know, over and over through the conversation, which I really like, because you're pushing for the transcendent to be more apparent, right? To be the goal, the end, the telos, and you're sort of insisting on that. Whereas the novel is very much, taking place in a fallen world, the lapsometer, right? You have to accept the fact that we're all both in need of a lapsometer and really ultimately can't be healed by a lapsometer, right?
Yeah.
So that sort of acceptance of our fallen condition.
Well, so you're half
both,
right. You're half right about what I'm saying, because what I'm pointing out is that this novel stays short of transcendence for just the reasons you describe. I'm not looking to find this transcendence in the novel. I'm saying that that's part of what makes it modern, is this problematic relationship to transcendence that can't really rise above a gesture towards it. So I love the reading you guys have given me at the end, that he does find a true reconciliation and even a sacramental reconciliation at the end in his piece. But I still think that the evacuation of transcendence from the world that is characteristic of modernism, which is one of the things that the modern Catholic has to make peace with at the end of a novel like this, I want to resist any move to normalize that and say that this is a description of the human condition rather than a description of the modern condition.
I'll get really dangerous and suggest that the Middle Ages weren't, so entirely oriented toward, or looking toward the transcendent as we might sometimes think. That someone like Dante is layering out, hell and purgatory and paradise, because their sacramental experience was so normal, so everyday, that they could. So in the sacrament, you experience, presence, participation, being present in the kingdom of God. Paul's language of we're situated there, right? That's where we actually live and exist, simultaneously with the crying baby and the diaper that needs to be changed, and the whole family trying to liturgize together. Not a necessarily easier, pretty process on most days, but it's all there. Like, and then in the Middle Ages, I think all of life had that quality of kind of this incredible, immanent, embodied, mundane. They were so grounded and so in touch with the mundane in Middle Ages, partly because technology didn't, buffer them, didn't sort of create any kind of layer of separation with the everyday world. They could do both. So Dante's, I feel like, talking about mundanity, the mundane and the transcendent, by layering things out in this journey, but he would see every day as containing all three. Like every day of he's talking about every day of human life, but just sort of categorizing them in a very stylized and hierarchical way. It's interesting. The book actually reminded me a lot in the very opening line, because it's situated in a wood.
Yep.
The first sentence, as we started making these Dante comparisons, I'm like, oh, there's probably a lot more here. Walker Percy certainly would have done something like that.
Yeah.
So I bet there's a lot going on that we're not even kind of tapping into.
I did have a note about that he's in the grove at the beginning, and he seems sort of lost, and I think there's something there.
I'll make one more point about this, just because I still think you guys would think I'm saying something I'm not saying, but I'll let it rest after this. So come at it this way. The whole point of the sacraments is that the transcendent and the mundane meet. And we're all talking about sacraments. So nobody is saying not the mundane and nobody is saying not the transcendent. But when you're in the sacramental moment, one or the other of those dynamics could fill your vision more. And in the modern world, contemporary modern Catholic literature, what you're filled with in the sacramental moments of the joining of those two is the appearance of bread and wine. The mundane parts are forefront, not denying the transcendent meaning of those things, but nevertheless, what you're seeing is bread and wine, or the accidents of bread and wine. In the medieval mind, in the sacramental moment, what's forefront is the vision of Christ. That's why there's so many Eucharistic visions. They're never forgetting the fact that they're really seeing the appearance of bread and wine. They're really in some particular church celebrating. They're in Paris as opposed to being in Rome or whatever. But their eyes are always fixed on the spiritual reality that is revealed in the sacramental moment, whereas the modernist tends to get caught up on tends to focus his attention on the sacramental elements themselves. To me, that makes a big difference, because both worshipers are worshiping in the ruins. As you say, both worshipers are worshiping in a fallen world, a lapsarian world, and so a lapsometer is relevant. One of those worshipers is worshiping with their eyes full of the ruins, and so there's this almost Kierkegaardian act of faith that's a leap into the absurd beyond what appearances ground. Another one of those worshipers is worshiping suspended ecstasis out of the ruins, lifted temporarily into the heavenly realms in that moment of worship. Both of those things are true worship experiences that we humans have in the face of the sacraments. But I think that it makes a very big difference to the character of the text that you write, which one of those things you fill your eyes with. And so I agree that there is a commonality between. I love the parallels with Dante and Percy, and now I kind of wish that we would just go through and find all the Dante parallels and lay them out. There's probably an article out there somewhere. We should go look for it. But let me tag this into another thing that I wanted to make sure we said before we finish, which is this notion that we started with of some of the satire in this book feels so much more contemporary now than it would have when Jesse read it 15 years ago, or possibly one can imagine than it even would have felt when Percy wrote it. Yeah. And this is something that is I'm feeling myself saying that thing a lot because our current moment feels like a caricature. But also I think this is actually something one should expect to find with modern literature because of one characterization of where we find ourselves in time. You know, we're not in the medieval world, we're not in the Renaissance world, we're not in the modern world technically, and then what do you call it? Is it the postmodern world? And one teacher of mine made the point that postmodernity is really hypermodernity. It's not something other than modernity that comes after. It's doubling down on modernity and digging deeper into the morass. And so if the time we live in is hyper modern rather than postmodern in a literal sense, then we should expect that all the times that we go back to modern literature, those things that were so salient then will be even more hyped up now because we've dug deeper into that. We've doubled down on technology and dehumanization and all these other sorts of things. And I think that for me, this novel makes that point very, very beautifully.
Yeah. Beautifully said. You covered a lot right there, actually. But that was great.
We're running out of time, Jesse. We got to lock it up.
That's right. That's right. So one last kind of follow-up question, Junius, because I think your point about sort of the modern sacramental moment and the medieval sacramental moment is a well taken, and I mean I think it is in some way true. So, and you kind of were more conciliar, maybe sounding in that last bit. It sounded like you're saying there is room sort of for both emphases or that it's not that one is necessarily wrong over the other, but
right.
What do we sort of lose when we emphasize one over the other? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like, what is the impact of that?
Yeah. My sense, it's easier for me to say the modern one because I'm more medieval by nature.
Sure.
So I'll start with that one, but then I will challenge myself to properly critique myself. I think that the danger of focusing too much on the sacramental signs and not enough on the what we would call in the Middle Ages the res sacramenti, the reality that those signs are pointing towards, is that it's harder to see the sacramental signs transformed, but only when we see them transformed by the reality they point to does that shmemonic moment that Jesse pointed to earlier happen. We only really learn the truth of bread in the sacramental moment if we see it deeply embedded in the reality that it has been taken up to signify. So I think that's the danger. And I believe we see that with modern literature where there is a tendency to get stuck on the physical and to not for the meaning not to feel like enough. And I think that's the danger. It doesn't automatically happen, but it's the danger. The danger with the medieval view is the thing that I think that you guys were afraid that I was saying, at least I detected in Jesse's comments, which is that if you go too quickly from the elements to the sacramental reality, then the elements feel dispensable. It's like the idea that you're climbing up to a plateau, which is just the next stage in your journey. You don't need to go back. And so with the ladder you use to get up there, you could kick it away when you're done. You don't need the ladder anymore. It has no more purpose for you. And that's an equally bad error, right? And so I think the solution is we have to rigorously keep both in mind. The sacrament is the moment of union of the mundane, the ordinary and the extraordinary, the natural and the supernatural, the physical and the spiritual. And if we get too focused on either one, we're not achieving that spirit man unity that Dr. Moore was hoping to get to.
I think that is perfectly said, and I'm not really sure there's a whole lot that we could do that would top that.
I'm just so delighted to have been in a conversation that included the term shmemonic. So.
I've just made it up and now it's a word.
Trademark. Well, good. Well, one thing we like to do to sort of close our conversations is our end notes. where we talk about something, could be from pop culture or another resource or book that might help us better understand what we were reading and some of those themes. So, Junius, do you have an end note for us?
I do, and it fell into my lap this morning, and it's a little bit weird, so bear with me. It is the song Mr. Roboto by Styx from their 1983 album Kilroy Was Here. And I'll just read a few of the lyrics to sort of motivate why I think it's a good fit, but you really have to listen to it because it is an astounding song. It's so good. It says, "You're wondering who I am. Secret, secret, I've got a secret. Machine or mannequin with parts made in Japan. I am the modern man. I've got a secret I've been hiding under my skin. My heart is human. My blood is boiling. My brain, IBM. So if you see me acting strangely, don't be surprised. I'm just a man who needed someone and somewhere to hide to keep me alive." Right. And as the song goes on, you realize that the speaker is the robot, but the robot is presenting himself as a man. And so there's the secret is being a robot. And so there's the stashing of his true nature underneath that. And it's a critique of dependence upon technology. It's a critique of replacing the human with the robotic, but it also acknowledges the attractiveness of that. The most famous part of the song is the "Domo arigato, Mr. Roboto." Thank you, Mr. Robot, for doing the jobs that nobody wants to. Right. So I think there's a lot of really good resonances between that song and this text.
That is not at all what I would have expected an end note to be, but I love it. That's fantastic.
No one expects the Junius Inquisition.
Jesse, do you have an end note?
Yeah, I'm not fully familiar with the format, so I may violate it slightly. But one thing that connects in my mind that hasn't come up is Wendell Berry's book, The Hidden Wound, which is about race relationships in American history. And he, I think there is a thesis we referenced in our conversation to the novel here with Walter Percy, but that would be shared with this book by Wendell Berry, that in a sense, one of the sort of keys to the brokenness of America and the brokenness of our story is, slavery of African peoples. So, and it has kind of a surprise twist. So there's some fun comparison points there, I think. And his is nonfiction. This is a novel fiction, but that would be cool to tease out.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. I love that. We could also maybe do an honorary mention of All Things Are Full of Gods by David Bentley Hart. It's a fantastic book. I haven't read all of it. I know you have, and you've written a review about it. But I have read a good chunk of it, and man, it is really excellent.
Yeah, my reviews coming out isn't out yet in the Christian Century in their book notes. It's like special edition. So yeah, it was super fun. And yeah, the mind-body problem is integral to this novel as well. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah. What a great book that is. I just think, yeah, more could be said about it, but I will stop. For my end note, I think Flannery O'Connor has an essay in Mysteries and Manners called Some Aspects of the Grotesque in Southern Fiction. There's also another essay called The Fiction Writer and His Country, which I think is also apt for what Percy's doing. But I think both of those together can really maybe be helpful. You kind of see O'Connor, who very much like Percy, I mean, she's Southern, she's Catholic, she's grappling with faith, she's grappling with modernity, she's grappling with all the sort of eccentricities and absurdities of American culture. And so she discusses how our use of fiction should try to shock modern readers out of a sense of complacency, which I think is kind of what Percy does in this book. I mean, I think that's the point of the over-the-top satire, is to do that. It has to be sort of a stark, a jolt. And she of course also has insights into grace and the role of faith that I think overlap with Percy's emphases quite a bit. So that's what I would recommend for this book.
Cool.
Well, Jesse, thanks again for being here with us today. This was great. I think we'll have to have you on again at some point in the future.
I'd be delighted. This was so much fun. Thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure.
our next book is Journey of the Mind to God by Bonaventure, which is going to be a really good read in light of the conversation we were just having about transcendence and the medieval sacramental moment and the modern sacramental moment. So I'm excited to do that. And we're going to do it in kind of a different format, which we will maybe reveal at a later date. So very excited for that. Thanks for coming on this journey with us, listeners. And in the meantime, keep reading.